It was her first time, and the millionaire lost control. When she whispered, "Go slow," something in that moment changed everything between them. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to find out what happened that night. Neither of them would ever forget. Ren's hand trembled on the steering wheel of the most expensive car she'd ever seen in her life. The supple leather exhaled that unmistakable scent of luxury, mixed with the woody cologne of Callum sitting beside her. Through the windshield, the winding road through the Blue Ridge Mountains unfolded like a ribbon of black asphalt between century-old pines. The April sun filtered through the branches, creating dancing spots of light on the precious wood dashboard. "Go slowly," she murmured, eyes wide, her knuckles whitening on the wheel. What she didn't know was that this simple request would trigger a transformation that neither of them was prepared to face. Sometimes, the simplest words carry the weight of entire destinies, and these two words, "go slowly," would resonate between them like a prophecy whispered by the Carolina wind. Callum Reed observed his new personal assistant with an attention he usually reserved for financial statements. At 43, he'd learned to read people like others read the Wall Street Journal, quickly, efficiently, without parasitic emotions. But something in Ren's raw vulnerability destabilized him in a way he didn't yet understand. She wore a black suit, purchased from a modest boutique in Charleston, probably with the first paycheck of her life. The seams were perfect, the fabric impeccable, but you could see in the details, the slightly different buttons, the hand-sewn hem, that it came from a world different from his. This observation troubled him more than he would have admitted. "You're driving well," he said finally, his voice breaking the tense silence filling the cabin. Ren swallowed hard. "I lie badly, Mr. Reed. I'm terrified. This car probably costs more than everything my family owns." The brutal honesty hit him like a ray of sunlight piercing clouds. In his world of calculated negotiations and professional smiles, no one ever admitted fear. Vulnerability was perceived as a weakness to exploit, not a truth to respect. "Then why did you accept this job?" he asked, genuinely curious now. She turned her head slightly toward him, just enough for him to see the fire burning in her hazel eyes. "Because I've spent my whole life being told I wasn't enough. Not rich enough, not sophisticated enough, not everything enough. And I decided that the only person who should decide who I am is me." In that moment, as the car negotiated a sharp curve and Ren gripped the wheel with fierce determination, Callum felt something crack in the fortress he'd built around his heart. It was a minuscule crack, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And like any crack in an apparently solid structure, it promised either collapse or transformation. Ren was only 22 when she accepted the position as personal assistant to the most feared entrepreneur in the Carolinas. Coming from a modest family in Charleston, she carried three distinctive characteristics: a silent determination that shone in her honey-colored eyes, a brutal honesty that prevented her from lying even when it would have been convenient, and an insatiable curiosity that pushed her to question everything. Her internal conflict was constant, the burning desire to prove her worth in a world that had always underestimated her, versus the paralyzing fear of not belonging to this universe of marble and crystal in Charlotte. Callum, at 43, had built a real estate empire after growing up in the poor neighborhoods of South Boston. His primary motivation was to ensure that no one would ever know the humiliation of poverty he'd experienced in the narrow alleys of Southie. Controlled, calculating, he planned every move of his life as if it were a chess game in a downtown cafe, until that April morning. The driving test was part of the training. She would need to drive important clients on the roads of the Carolina coast, and he insisted on personally evaluating every skill of his employees. But when she gripped the wheel for the first time, her sweaty hands slipping on the leather, something in Callum broke. Her vulnerability, so raw and authentic, transported him to his own early days, when he too didn't know how to properly use silverware in a fancy restaurant in Manhattan, when he too asked to go slowly. There are moments in life when everything changes, where a simple request, "go slowly," becomes the beginning of a story that will redefine everything you thought you knew about yourself. The offices of Reed Properties occupied 3 floors of a historic building on Trade Street in Charlotte. The lobby was a cathedral of Vermont marble and glass, where every step echoed like a judgment. Ren walked through the doors that first Monday morning, with a mix of terror and excitement that made her want to both vomit and dance. The smell of the place was that of money, luxury paper, leather chairs, espresso imported from Seattle. Even the air seemed purer here, filtered by systems that most people couldn't afford in their entire homes. Miss Hartley, a woman in her 50s dressed in a Brooks Brothers suit that probably cost 3 months' salary, approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mrs. Sullivan, the Director of Human Resources, had the gaze of a hawk evaluating its prey. "Welcome to Reed Properties. Follow me, I'll show you your workstation." Wren's desk was strategically positioned just outside Callum's, a space of glass and steel where she could see everything that came in and went out. It was both a privilege and a transparent prison. Everyone would be able to see her, judge her, measure if she was up to par. "Mr. Reed is demanding," said Mrs. Sullivan, placing a stack of files on the desk with a thud. "The last assistant didn't last 3 months. She cried in the bathrooms every afternoon." Wren felt her stomach contract, but kept her face neutral. "I don't cry easily. We'll see." Mrs. Sullivan's smile was that of a cat who already knows the end of the story. "First rule, Mr. Reed takes his coffee at 7 sharp. Black, no sugar, in the blue ceramic mug, never in another. Second rule, he detests being interrupted while reading morning reports. Third rule," the list continued for 20 minutes. Wren noted everything meticulously in a notebook she'd bought the day before. Recycled paper, simple cover, but the pages were filled with her determination to succeed. At 6:55, she was already in front of the Italian espresso machine that looked like a chrome spaceship. Her hands trembled slightly as she prepared the coffee exactly as instructed. The rich aroma filled the space, mixing with the smell of her own nervousness. Callum arrived at 7 on the dot, like a Swiss watch. He wore a charcoal grey suit that fit his figure perfectly, a navy tie, always navy on Fridays she would discover later, and a watch that probably cost more than her mother's car. "Good morning, Miss Hartley." "Good morning, Mr. Reed." She handed him the mug, praying her hands wouldn't shake. He took a sip, his steel blue eyes studying her over the rim of the mug. A moment stretched, heavy with judgment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Good. Bring me the Portland property files. We have a meeting at 9. That was all. No compliment, no criticism. Just the pure and simple efficiency of a man who had built an empire by not wasting time on unnecessary formalities. The first hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Wren answered phones, organized appointments, took notes during meetings. She was constantly in motion, like a dancer in a ballet whose complete choreography she didn't yet know. At noon, when most of the office emptied for the sacred American lunch break, she stayed at her post eating a sandwich she'd brought from home. "You're not having lunch?" Callum's voice made her jump. He had exited his office silently, like a ghost in a 3-piece suit. I have work to finish." "Everyone has lunch, Miss Hartley. It's a non-negotiable rule in my company." There was something in his tone, not quite kindness, but not coldness either, something in between. "I don't want to seem—" She searched for the right word. "Presumptuous. Taking a full break on my first day." Callum looked at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You think working non-stop will prove your worth?" "Yes." "You're wrong." He returned toward his office, then turned around. "Worth isn't proven through exhaustion, but through excellence. And excellence requires that you take care of yourself. 1 hour for lunch. That's an order." This was the first lesson, and it wasn't about business. The first major test came the second week, a crucial meeting with Japanese investors, the kind of negotiation that could make or break an entire quarter. Wren had to prepare everything. The documents, the translations, the room arrangement, even the choice of appropriate tea. She spent 3 nights checking and rechecking everything. The dark circles under her eyes testified to her dedication, but also to her paralyzing fear of making a mistake that would cost millions. On the day of the meeting, she arrived at the office at 5 in the morning. The city was still asleep. Charlotte's streets bathed in that grey and soft light that precedes dawn. The bakeries were just beginning to light their ovens, filling the air with the smell of fresh bread. She arranged everything with surgical precision. The documents were aligned perfectly, the water glasses positioned at equal distances, the pens all pointing in the same direction. It was obsessive, she knew, but it was also her armor against the chaos of her own insecurities. At 8, Callum arrived and stopped dead seeing the conference room. "What time did you get here?" 5. "Why?" "Because I couldn't sleep. What if I'd forgotten something? What if—" "Ren." It was the first time he'd used her first name. The sound of his voice pronouncing those 4 letters made her shiver. "You can't control everything. You're going to destroy yourself." "With respect, sir, isn't that exactly what you do?" The silence that followed was charged with electricity. Callum looked at her as if she'd just shown him a mirror he'd spent 20 years avoiding. "Touché," he said finally, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But it took me 20 years to develop this bad habit." "Don't start so young." The meeting was a success. The Japanese investors signed the contract, impressed by the professionalism and attention to detail. When they left, one of them bowed to Ren and said in English, "You have a rare talent. Don't waste it." Later that afternoon, as the sun declined over Charlotte's rooftops, Callum called her into his office. "Sit down." She obeyed, her heart pounding. Would he praise her, criticize her, fire her for her morning impertinence? "You said something to me today that made me think," he began, his fingers drumming softly on the massive oak desk. "You held up a mirror. Few people have the courage to do that. I didn't mean to be disrespectful." "You weren't. You were honest." He stood and walked to the window, looking at the city stretching beneath him like a conquered kingdom. "I built all this by controlling every variable, planning every move. But you know what I lost along the way?" Ren waited, not knowing if the question was rhetorical. "The ability to let go, to trust, to—" He paused, searching for the word. "To live spontaneously. Every moment is calculated, measured, optimized. And I woke up one morning a few years ago and realized I couldn't remember the last time I did something just because it made me happy." The vulnerability in his voice was heartbreaking. Ren realized she was seeing behind the curtain, behind the ruthless businessman, toward something more fragile and human. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked softly. He turned, and for the first time, she saw fatigue in his eyes. Not physical fatigue, but something deeper, older. "Because you remind me of who I was before I became this." He made a vague gesture toward the luxurious office. "And maybe because I don't want you to make the same mistakes." That evening, riding home on the crowded subway, Ren reflected on the conversation. She had accepted this job to prove her worth, to escape the limits imposed by her modest birth. But something more complex was developing, a connection she didn't yet understand but felt in every interaction, like a melody played just beyond her conscious hearing capacity. "You're going too fast with me," Ren confessed 3 weeks later, during a meeting that had extended until dawn. She wasn't talking about the car this time. He was training her in complex negotiations, throwing information like arrows, expecting her to catch them mid-flight. The sound of rain beating against the office windows on West Trade Street created an unplanned intimacy. She could taste the bitter black coffee she insisted on drinking, could see the lines of fatigue around his eyes, could hear her own accelerated breathing while the aroma of croissants from a nearby bakery rose to the 15th floor. The first twist arrived silently. Callum began cancelling appointments to extend training sessions. His associates in Boston were surprised. He never cancelled anything. Courage doesn't consist of never being afraid. It consists of doing what's necessary, despite the terror that freezes your blood. The third week brought a new challenge, the subtle but omnipresent hostility of the other employees. In the hallways, conversations stopped when she passed. In the break room, smiles were forced, greetings mechanical. She was the outsider, the girl from Charleston who had mysteriously obtained the most coveted position in the company. Mrs. Patricia, a senior secretary who had worked at Reed for 15 years, was particularly glacial. 52 years old, impeccably dressed, with pearls that seemed to be a permanent extension of her neck, she reigned over the other assistants like a queen over her court. "Miss Hartley," her voice was poisoned honey, "Mr. Reed seems to grant you a lot of attention." They were in the common kitchen, where the smell of coffee mixed with that of tension. Ren was preparing Callum's lunch. He'd mentioned he liked simple sandwiches, sourdough bread and aged cheddar, nothing extravagant. "He trains all his assistants personally," Ren responded, keeping her voice neutral. "Not like this." Mrs. Patricia moved closer, her presence invading Wren's space. In 15 years, I've never seen him cancel meetings to extend training sessions. I've never seen him take an interest in an employee's personal life. So either you're exceptional or... She left the sentence hanging, the insinuation clear as crystal. Wren's blood boiled. Or what, Mrs. Patricia? Say what you really think. I think you should be careful. People talk. And in our world, reputation is everything. That evening, Wren stayed late at the office, alone with her thoughts and the hum of computers on standby. Through the window, Charlotte glittered with 1,000 lights, each illuminated window representing a life, a dream, a story. She felt so small in the face of this immensity. You're still here? Callum's voice made her jump for the second time in 3 weeks. He had the habit of moving silently, as if gliding on the floor rather than walking. I was... thinking. He entered the room, still wearing his suit but with the tie loosened, the first sign of disorder she'd ever seen on him. About what? About people, about what they think, about... She stopped, not knowing how to articulate the knot of emotions in her chest. Callum sat on the edge of her desk, an informal posture that surprised her. Let me guess. Mrs. Patricia spoke to you today. How? Because she speaks to all my assistants. It's her hobby. His tone was light, but his eyes were serious. What did she say? Wren hesitated, then decided on honesty. That you treat me differently. That people are talking. And what do you think? I think... She took a deep breath. I think she's right. You do treat me differently. The question is, why? The silence that followed was charged with unspoken things. Callum looked at her with an intensity that made her feel naked, as if every defense she'd built was transparent before him. Do you want the honest truth? He finally asked. Always. I don't know. He laughed softly, a sound without humor. You remind me of something I lost, or maybe you represent something I never had. This authenticity, this ability to say exactly what you think, without the layers of politics and manipulation. But it complicates things, Wren said softly. Yes, it complicates things enormously. They stood there in silence, the city glowing beneath them, two people on the edge of a precipice that neither wanted to cross but couldn't ignore. I don't want to be the source of gossip, Wren finally said. I don't want my work questioned because what? Because there's something between us that I don't understand yet. The honesty of the moment was almost painful. Callum nodded slowly. Then we establish clear boundaries. I'm your boss. You're my employee. And whatever might be beyond that, we ignore it. For now, she repeated, and the weight of those words suggested they both recognized that for now wasn't forever. 2 months passed. Wren learned to negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts, to read financial statements, to identify lies between the lines. But she also learned that he took his coffee without sugar because his mother never had the means to buy it, that he always wore navy ties on Fridays in honor of his father who dreamed of the ocean, that his left hand trembled imperceptibly when he was nervous. The 4th month brought a crisis that would force a decision. A major contract in Seattle required Callum to leave for 2 weeks. Normally, he brought his personal assistant on these long trips, but this time he hesitated. I'm going alone, he announced during their morning meeting, his tone deliberately professional. Wren felt something contract in her chest. Why? Because it's more appropriate. Appropriate. She repeated the word as if it were poison in her mouth. Since when do you care about what's appropriate? Since the rumors started affecting your reputation. My reputation? Her voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. I'm the one who signed the $15 million contract. I'm the one who organized 3 major acquisitions last month. My reputation should be based on my work, not on malicious gossip. Callum stood from his desk, approaching the window as he always did when uncomfortable. You don't understand how this world works. Then explain it to me. She stood too, refusing to be relegated to an inferior position. Explain why my excellent work matters less than what people imagine. Because in this world, perception is reality. He turned abruptly, and for the first time, she saw raw frustration on his face. You can be the best, and they'll always find a way to diminish your accomplishments if it suits their narrative. And you're okay with that? No. But I'm pragmatic. Pragmatism is just another word for cowardice when it serves to avoid what's right. The silence that followed was electric. Wren realized she'd just crossed a line, but she couldn't help it. Something in her refused to accept this solution. "Get out," Callum said quietly, dangerously calm. "What?" "Get out of my office, now." She left, trembling with anger and something else, a pain she didn't want to name. In the bathroom, she splashed cold water on her face, looking at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were red, but she refused to cry. She'd told Mrs. Sullivan she didn't cry easily, and she would keep that promise. The following 2 weeks were the longest of her life. Callum left for Seattle without a word of goodbye. The office seemed empty without his presence, as if someone had extinguished a central fire and left everyone in the cold. Wren threw herself into work with fierce intensity. She arrived before everyone and left after. She managed files with an efficiency that impressed even Mrs. Patricia. But at night, alone in her small apartment in Noda, she stared at the ceiling and wondered if she'd destroyed everything, with her inability to accept necessary compromises. On the 13th day, a package arrived at her desk. No sender's name, just her name in elegant handwriting. Inside, she found an old book on Southern architecture, a subject she'd mentioned in passing during one of their late-night conversations, and a note. "Go slowly with yourself. You're right about everything, but the world changes slowly. Go home this weekend. Your family misses you. See." She held the note against her chest, the tears she'd held back for 2 weeks finally flowing freely. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was an acknowledgement. A hand extended across the chasm they'd dug between them. That evening she took the train to Charleston. Her mother welcomed her with tears of joy, immediately noticing the fatigue around her eyes. "Sweetheart, you're working too hard." "I know, Mom." Wren collapsed on the worn sofa in the small living room, the familiar smell of dried lavender and chicken pot pie wrapping around her like a blanket. "But I can't stop now." "Why?" "What are you trying to prove?" That was the question, wasn't it? What was she trying to prove, and to whom? Callum returned on a rainy Monday morning, the city of Charlotte washed by a downpour that made the stones glisten. Wren was at her desk, preparing his usual coffee, her hands surprisingly steady. He entered, depositing his briefcase, removing his wet coat. Their eyes met, and 1,000 unspoken things passed between them in that gaze. "Good morning, Miss Hartley." "Good morning, Mr. Reed." The formality was armor they both wore. "Thank you for the book," she finally said. "You received it. Good." He took the coffee, drank a sip. "How was your weekend at home?" "Necessary. My mother fed me, forced me to sleep, and reminded me who I was before I came here." "And who are you?" "Someone who refuses to accept that the world must stay as it is simply because it's always been that way." Callum smiled, a real smile this time, reaching his eyes. "That's exactly what I thought." He took a few steps toward his office, then stopped. The Seattle contract was signed, $12 million. It was my biggest deal in 3 years. "Congratulations." "I couldn't focus during the last meeting. Do you know why?" Wren shook her head, her heart beginning to beat faster. "Because you weren't there to remind me to slow down, to breathe, to remember why I do all this." He turned to face her completely. "I realized something in Seattle, watching the Puget Sound at sunset." "What?" "That I've spent 20 years building an empire, but I've never built a life. And you make me want to build a life." The words floated between them, heavy with meaning. Wren felt her breath catch in her throat. "But it's complicated," he continued. "The age, the position, the appearances." "So what do we do?" she asked, the same question she'd asked in Portland. "We go slowly," he said simply. "We continue working together. We continue learning from each other. And we see where it takes us, without rushing, without forcing." "Okay?" "Okay." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of romance. It was something more subtle and perhaps more powerful, a mutual agreement to allow themselves to feel what they were feeling without judgment or haste. The weeks that followed took on a new quality. Callum began to teach her, truly teach, the subtleties of his profession. Not just how to negotiate contracts, but how to read people, how to understand what they weren't saying, how to navigate the murky waters of corporate politics. "Watch the hands," he told her, during a meeting with investors from Atlanta. "When someone lies, Their hands betray the truth before their lips. She observed, learned, absorbed. She was a sponge, and he was the ocean. But he was learning from her too. How to laugh at his own mistakes. How to take a 2-hour lunch without guilt. How to notice the small things. The way light changed in the office in the afternoon. How the barista downstairs now knew their orders by heart. How the pigeons on the window ledge returned every day at the same time. "You make me aware of things I'd forgotten," he admitted one late evening as they worked together on a particularly complex file. "Like what?" "Like the fact that living and existing aren't the same thing." The real test came with the invitation to traditional Sunday dinner at the Reed home. Mrs. Margot, Callum's mother, had finally expressed the desire to meet the assistant her son spoke of so often. "You're not obligated to accept," Callum said, but his tone suggested he hoped she would. "No, I'll go," Wren decided, even though the idea terrified her more than any business meeting. The family home was a historic brownstone in Myers Park. When Wren crossed the threshold that sunny Sunday, she entered a world that seemed to belong to another century. Antique hardwood floors, period furniture, master paintings on the walls. The smell of traditional pot roast filled the air, rich and complex. Mrs. Margot greeted her with glacial politeness. At 70, she wore her age with rigid elegance, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her pearls impeccable, her steel blue eyes evaluating Wren like a general evaluates the battlefield. "Miss Hartley, how nice." The tone suggested it was anything but nice. "Mrs. Reed, thank you for the invitation." The table was set with a perfection that seemed to belie actual use. Lenox porcelain, antique silver, Waterford crystal glasses. Wren silently counted 3 forks, 4 knives, and desperately wondered which to use first. "So, Miss Hartley," Mrs. Margot began as the appetizer was served, "Callum tells me you're from Charleston." The tone made Charleston sound like a strange and exotic word, almost suspect. "Yes, ma'am, I grew up there." "Charming. And your parents? What do they do?" "My mother is a nurse. My father wasn't present." A silence fell over the table. Callum's sister, Sloane, a 35-year-old woman who resembled a feminine and softer version of her brother, cast a compassionate look at Wren. "How interesting," Mrs. Margot finally said, the word interesting carrying all the weight of her judgment. Wren felt something boil within her, that familiar anger against class prejudices that had defined her life. She took a deep breath, then spoke with calm clarity. "My mother raised me alone. She worked double shifts so I could go to school. She taught me that dignity doesn't come from what you own, but from how you treat others. And I'm here today, not because I'm seeking to marry your son, ma'am, but because I'm excellent at my work, and I've earned my place." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Margot slowly put down her fork, her eyes narrowed on Wren. "You're direct. Always." "I lie very badly." To Wren's surprise, Callum's mother smiled, a real smile, thin but authentic. "My son also lied very badly in his youth, before he learned to play the game. Perhaps you're right never to learn." The rest of the meal was less tense, though still precarious. Wren used the wrong forks twice and didn't care. She talked about her work, her ambitions, her plans to study architecture at Duke. Sloane brightened up, sharing her own passion for historic building restoration. But it was in the kitchen, as Wren helped clear the table, against Mrs. Margot's protests, that the real conversation took place. "My son is different since you've been working for him," the matriarch said, methodically washing the crystal glasses. "Different how?" "More present. He smiles more. He calls more often." She paused, her hands immersed in soapy water. "You've made him human again, and I don't know whether I should thank you or warn you." "Warn me against what?" "Against the wounds that love can inflict, particularly when it crosses the boundaries that society likes to maintain." She turned to look at Wren directly. "Do you love him?" The question was so direct that Wren stumbled over her answer. I don't know. It's complicated. Love is always complicated. The question isn't whether it's simple, but whether it's worth it. Sometimes the most important truths are whispered in kitchens, where society's masks are temporarily removed, and where we can be simply human. The 5th month brought the crisis Wren had dreaded. The incident began innocently. An error in a contract she'd prepared, a detail missed in the frenzy of a tight deadline. It was nothing catastrophic, easily correctable, but Mrs. Patricia discovered it and ensured the information circulated throughout the office like wildfire. "You see," Wren heard whispered in the hallways, "she's not so competent after all. Maybe her qualifications were based on other talents." The insinuations were clear, venomous, designed to destroy her credibility and confidence. Wren felt her world collapse around her. Every glance in the office seemed to contain judgment. Every conversation stopped at her approach seemed to be about her. The worst was the board meeting where she had to present a financial analysis. Normally confident, she felt her hands tremble as she distributed the documents. One of the board members, a man in his 60s with graying sideburns and a condescending smile, interrupted her mid-presentation. "Miss Hartley, are you certain of these figures? After a little error last week, we must be careful." The room became silent. Wren felt her face grow hot, her ears buzz. She looked at Callum, hoping for support, but his face was a professional mask, impossible to read. "The figures are correct," she said, her voice weaker than she wanted. "I've checked everything 3 times. "Of course." The board member's tone suggested he didn't believe her at all. After the meeting, Wren took refuge in the women's bathroom, her hand pressed against her mouth to stifle the sobs threatening to overwhelm her. She looked at herself in the mirror, her red eyes, her slightly smudged makeup, the very image of defeat. "You're not going to cry," she whispered to herself. "You're stronger than this." But she was lying. The tears flowed despite her efforts, years of pressure and doubt finally escaping. She didn't know Callum was outside, waiting. When she finally emerged 10 minutes later, her face washed but her eyes still revealing, he was there leaning against the wall. "Come," he said simply, and she followed him to his office. Once the door was closed, he exploded in a way she'd never seen. "Who circulated the information about your error? It doesn't matter. It matters very much. You made a small mistake anyone could have made. The fact that it became a scandal is manipulation. Maybe they're right," she said softly, collapsing in the chair. "Maybe I'm not good enough for this place. Maybe I was stupid to think I could belong to this world." "Stop." His voice was fierce. "Don't let their insecurities become your truth." "But why didn't you defend me in there?" The words exploded from her before she could stop them. "Why did you stay silent when he humiliated me?" Callum looked away, his jaw clenched. "Because if I had defended you, it would have confirmed all their suspicions. It would have made things worse. So you let me drown to protect appearances. I let you fight your own battle because you're strong enough to do it. And because if I always fight for you, you'll never be respected on your own merits." The logic was impeccable and heartbreaking at the same time. Wren understood, intellectually but emotionally. She felt abandoned. "I think I should resign," she said finally. "What? No. Why not? Everyone already thinks the worst. And honestly, I'm tired. Tired of constantly having to prove my worth, tired of fighting invisible battles, tired of—" Her voice broke. "Tired of never being enough." Callum crossed the room and, in a gesture that surprised them both, took her hands in his. "You are more than enough. You are exceptional. And I refuse to let you give up because mediocre people feel threatened by your brilliance." "You don't understand," she whispered. "You were born poor, yes, but you're a man. The world gave you opportunities it will never give me. Every success I have is questioned. Every mistake is magnified. I'm exhausted." The silence that followed was laden with the painful truth of her words. Callum had no answer, because she was right. The system was unfair, and all his will couldn't change this fundamental reality. "Then we change it," he said finally. "How? I don't know yet. But we find a way. Together." That night, Wren didn't sleep. She sat by the window of her small apartment, watching Charlotte stretch beneath her. This city of lights and shadows, of dreams and disillusions. The Bank of America tower sparkled in the distance, its clock marking the hours like a metronome of her existential crisis. She thought back to the young girl from Charleston who had accepted this job with so much hope and ambition. What had she gained? What had she lost? Was the price of success worth the emotional cost? Her phone rang. Callum. "You're not sleeping either?" he asked without preamble. "No. How did you know?" "Because I know you now, and because I'm not sleeping either." A comfortable silence settled between them. two insomniacs connected by the invisible waves of modern technology. "I thought about something," he finally said. "Do you know why you told me to go slowly that first day in the Blue Ridge? Because I was afraid." "No." His voice was soft but certain. "Because you instinctively knew something I'd forgotten, that speed isn't the same thing as progress, that sometimes slowing down is the bravest act. Where are you going with this?" "I'm saying that you were my teacher from day one. You taught me how to live again, and now you're teaching this entire company, whether you realize it or not, that there's another way of being, a more honest, more human way. They don't want to learn. Some don't want to, but others—" "I heard Sloane tell me the other day that she loved your honesty at the family dinner. I've heard junior assistants talking about how you always help them, even when you're overwhelmed. Change is slow, Ren, but it's coming." She closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her like gentle rain. "And us?" she asked. "What are we?" The pause that followed was weighted. "We're two people who found something rare, and I'd like to explore what that is if you'll let me, but only if it's what you want too. It's what I want." The words came out before she could stop them, honest and terrifying. "But I'm scared." "Me too." His laugh was soft, vulnerable. "I'm terrified, actually. But you know what I learned building my empire? Fear means something matters. If you're not afraid, you're not taking real risks." The next day, Ren arrived at the office with new determination. She wouldn't resign. She wouldn't let the Mrs. Patricias of the world define her worth, but she would change her approach. Instead of constantly trying to prove her worth, she decided simply to do her job excellently and let the results speak for themselves. Instead of reacting to gossip, she ignored it. Instead of seeking approval, she focused on excellence. The change was subtle but powerful. The gossip continued for a few weeks, then began to die down in the face of her indifference. The projects she managed succeeded one after another. Clients specifically requested to work with her. Mrs. Patricia attempted one last manipulation, a venomous report on professional appropriateness that she submitted to human resources. But this time something unexpected happened. Other employees, junior assistants, analysts, even some executives signed a counter letter praising Ren's professionalism and excellence. "We cannot let jealousy destroy talent," one of them wrote. "Miss Hartley represents the best of our company," wrote another. When Ren discovered these letters, she cried again, but this time from gratitude, relief, validation. She wasn't alone after all. The 6th month marked a decisive turning point. Callum convened an extraordinary meeting of all staff, something he'd never done in 20 years of running the company. In the main auditorium, decorated with abstract art and a spectacular view of Romare Bearden Park, 150 employees gathered, buzzing with speculation. Ren sat in the audience, hidden among the other assistants, not knowing what would happen. Callum stepped onto the stage, his suit impeccable as always, but something in his bearing was different, less rigid, more authentic. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying throughout the room. "I want to talk to you today about something I've always avoided, vulnerability." A murmur ran through the audience. This wasn't the kind of speech they were used to. "When I was 22, he continued, I had my first job interview at a prestigious firm. I wore a suit bought second-hand. My shoes were worn, and I was sweating so much I had to wipe my hands on my pants before shaking the CEO's hand. I didn't get the job." He paused, letting the words settle. "The interviewer told me I didn't have the necessary polish, that I seemed too hungry. In other words, my poverty showed, and that disqualified me." Ren felt her heart accelerate. She knew where this was going. "I spent the next 20 years building that polish, hiding where I came from, creating a persona that matched what people expected from a successful businessman. And somewhere along the way, I forgot who I really was." He scanned the room, stopping briefly on Ren. 6 months ago, I hired a personal assistant. She came from Charleston, from a modest family, and she was terrified to drive my car. And when she asked me to go slowly, something in me cracked. Glances began to turn toward Ren. She felt her face grow hot. "Since then, this woman has taught me more about leadership, authenticity, and courage than all the management books I've ever read. She made mistakes. Yes, a small error in a contract that some of you turned into a scandal. But she also closed $15 million deals, revolutionized our work processes, and showed a level of excellence few can match. The silence was total now. But most importantly, she did it while staying authentic, refusing to become someone else to fit in. And in a world where we all wear masks, that authenticity is revolutionary. He paused, then said the words that would change everything. The gossip about our relationship must end, not because it's true, we're professionals, but because it represents a toxic culture I will no longer tolerate in this company. If anyone has a problem with Miss Hartley's professional performance, bring me concrete evidence. Otherwise, focus on your own work. He scanned the room again, his authority unquestionable. We are a company built on excellence, but excellence without humanity, without authenticity, without mutual respect, is just an empty facade, and I refuse to preside over a facade. When he descended from the stage, the silence exploded into applause. Not everyone, Mrs. Patricia remained seated, rigid and silent, but the majority. And it was enough. Later that day, Wren was called into his office. "You didn't have to do that," she said immediately. "I know. Now everyone knows." "Knows what? That there's something between us that we're exploring slowly, carefully, while respecting our professional roles." "Yes, now they know. And you know what I realized? I don't care." Wren looked at him. This man who had spent 2 decades building walls, now tearing them down stone by stone. "What changed?" she asked softly. You changed. You showed me there's another way to live, a truer way." He approached but maintained a professional distance. "I can't promise it will be easy. People will always talk. Some will never accept us." "I know. But I can promise I'll be authentic with you. Always. No games, no manipulations, no masks. Just me. That's all I ask. Courage isn't found in the absence of fear, but in the decision to be authentic despite it. And sometimes the greatest revolution is simply telling the truth." The weeks that followed were a period of reconstruction. The atmosphere in the office changed gradually. Not completely, never completely, but enough to breathe. Mrs. Patricia was quietly transferred to another department, a mutual decision that allowed everyone to save face. But the real change happened in the relationship between Wren and Callum. They established clear rules. At the office they remained strictly professional. No favoritism, no affectionate gestures, no ambiguity. But after work hours, they allowed themselves to explore this growing connection between them. Their first real dates were delightfully ordinary. Coffee at a cafe in Plaza Midwood where nobody knew them. A walk along the Little Sugar Creek Greenway at sunset, watching joggers and cyclists pass by. A simple dinner at a neighborhood bistro, where the owner knew everyone by name. "It's strange," Wren said one evening, as they shared a bottle of North Carolina wine at a small place in Dilworth, "seeing you without the armor of the suit." Callum wore jeans and a simple sweater, a look Wren had never seen him wear. "You don't like it?" "I love it. You seem human." "I've always been human, Wren. I just forgot how to show it." She reached across the table, gently touching his fingers. "Thank you." "For what?" "For taking this risk. For choosing me despite all the complexity." "Choosing you wasn't complicated," he said simply. "It was the simplest thing I've ever done. Everything else, navigating other people's opinions, managing professional implications, that's complicated. But choosing you? Obvious." Meanwhile, Wren advanced on her own path. She enrolled at Duke University for evening courses in architecture, finally realizing her dream. On Fridays, she took the train south, the American landscape rolling past the window like a painting in motion. Callum supported her completely, even though it meant less time together. "Your dreams don't have to wait for me," he insisted. "If we're building something real, it will survive a weekend's distance." The university brought a new dimension to Wren's life. She found herself immersed in design theories, Gothic architecture history, sustainable building principles. Her professors, impressed by her work ethic and unique vision, encouraged her to consider a full career in the field. "You have an eye for space and form," said her main professor, a man in his 60s with thick-framed glasses. "It's rare. Don't waste it." But it was the conversation with her mother during a weekend in Charleston that brought true clarity. "Are you happy, sweetheart?" her mother asked, preparing traditional she-crab soup in their small kitchen, the smell of sherry and cream filling the air. "Yes, I think so." "Not think. Be sure." Her mother turned, the wooden spoon in her hand, like a scepter of wisdom. All your life you've been running, proving, pushing, climbing. But life isn't a mountain to conquer, it's an experience to savor. He makes me happy, Mum. Really happy. Then that's all that matters. It doesn't matter his age, his wealth, or what others think. If it's authentic, if it's true, then you protect it. Back in Charlotte, Wren carried these words like a talisman. She noticed how her perspective had changed. She no longer looked at the luxury of the offices with envy, but with detached appreciation. It was no longer a world she wanted to belong to. It was simply a world she worked in. The real transformation happened during a client meeting where Wren presented a major real estate development project alone. It was a test. Callum had deliberately absented himself to let her shine on her own. She entered the conference room with calm confidence. Her architectural drawings spread on the table, her vision clear and articulated. The clients, 3 businessmen from Raleigh accustomed to dealing with senior directors, were initially skeptical. But during her 80-minute presentation, something magical happened. She wasn't just selling them a building, she was selling them a vision of how spaces could transform lives, how architecture could honor history while embracing the future, how buildings could be both functional and beautiful. At the end, the main client, a 50-year-old man with graying temples and a piercing gaze, said, "We want to work with you specifically on this project, not your boss." You! It was the affirmation she'd always sought, and it came with a surprise. She realized she didn't need it anymore. She already knew her worth. The 7th month brought the ultimate test that neither had anticipated. A jealous competitor spread a malicious rumor that Wren had stolen trade secrets and sold them. It was entirely false, but in the Charlotte business world, mud sticks even when it's baseless. The accusation came in the form of an article on an influential business blog, vague enough to avoid lawsuits, but detailed enough to be damaging. Sources close to Reed Properties suggest that the company's recent successes may have dubious origins, involving a junior assistant who had unexplained access to sensitive information. Wren read the article on the subway that morning, her phone trembling in her hand. Nausea overwhelmed her. This was worse than the previous rumors. It was a direct attack on her integrity, the one thing she'd always fiercely protected. When she arrived at the office, the atmosphere was toxic. Furtive glances, stopped whispers, palpable tension. Mrs. Sullivan was waiting at her desk. "Mr. Reed wants to see you immediately." In his office, Callum was on the phone, his voice cold and professional. He motioned for Wren to sit, then ended the call with brutal efficiency. "You've read the article?" "Yes." Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "And? And it's false. Completely, absolutely false. I have never, ever betrayed your trust or this company." He looked at her intensely, his steel blue eyes scrutinizing her as if he could read directly into her soul. The silence stretched, heavy and terrible. "I know," he finally said. Relief hit her like a wave. "You believe me?" Without hesitation, without question, he stood, walking to the window, his familiar position of reflection. "But here's the problem. We need to prove it publicly. This rumor can destroy our company if we don't confront it head-on." How? By finding who actually leaked the information, because someone did, and exposing their motivation. The following 3 days were the most intense of Wren's life. Callum hired a private investigation team that examined every transaction, every email, every communication from the past 6 months. Wren voluntarily gave access to all her personal accounts, her finances, even her phone calls. "I have nothing to hide," she said firmly to the lead investigator, a former police detective with tired eyes that had seen too much. The investigation revealed the truth. The culprit was a disgruntled senior analyst who had been passed over for a promotion that Wren had essentially received, though she'd never officially applied. He had sold information to a competitor, then pointed the finger at Wren, counting on existing prejudices to make the accusation credible. When Callum confronted the man with evidence, digital traces, bank statements, colleague testimonies, he collapsed and confessed everything. The meeting that followed was cathartic. Callum convened all senior executives and, with the man who had accused Wren present and defeated, methodically exposed the truth. "This," he said, his voice like steel, is what happens when we allow prejudices to replace facts, when we judge people on their origins rather than their actions. Miss Hartley was slandered because some of you wanted to believe the worst. The silence in the room was oppressive. From today, this company operates under new principles. Integrity above all, facts before gossip, real excellence rather than appearances. And if anyone can't live by these standards, the door is there. Later, alone in her office, Wren finally let out the emotions she'd contained for 3 days. She cried, from relief, from anger, from exhaustion. Callum found her like that, hands covering her face, shoulders shaking. He said nothing, simply closed the door and took her in his arms. It was the first time they'd truly touched at the office, and it broke all their carefully constructed rules. But some moments transcend rules. "I'm sorry," he whispered in her hair. "I'm so sorry you had to endure this." "You believed me." Her voice was muffled against his chest. "Without hesitation, you believed me. Always." Winter arrived in Charlotte with its cold beauty, transforming the city into a postcard of twinkling lights and foggy streets. Wren and Callum had been together for 8 months now, a number that seemed both insignificant and monumental. What had begun as a complex professional connection had evolved into something deeper, more real. They still navigated the murky waters of their age difference and position, but with more grace now, with more confidence in what they were building. The decisive moment came one December night during the company's annual Christmas party. The event was held in a historic mansion in Eastover, its rooms adorned with glittering decorations, the smell of mulled wine and roasted chestnuts filling the air. Wren wore a simple but elegant dress, black without excessive ornaments, but it made her feel beautiful. She'd looked at herself in the mirror before leaving, barely recognizing the confident woman looking back. In 8 months, she'd transformed, not into someone else, but into a more complete version of herself. Callum saw her cross the room and his breath caught. He'd seen her every day for months, but tonight, something was different. It wasn't the dress or the makeup, it was the confidence in her walk, the way she held her head high, how she laughed with colleagues without that defensive tension she'd carried before. They had agreed to maintain professional distance at the event, but when their eyes met across the crowded room, all protocols seemed absurd. He approached, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "You're radiant," he said simply. "You're not bad yourself," she replied with a smile. They stood together, not too close, but not distant either, talking about trivialities while communicating something much deeper with their gazes. "I have something to ask you," Callum finally said. "Not here, not now, but soon." "Sounds serious." "It is." The atmosphere between them shifted, becoming charged with anticipation. Wren felt her heart accelerate, a mixture of fear and excitement coursing through her veins. 3 days later, they met at their favorite restaurant in Nodar, the place where they could just be themselves, away from the scrutinizing eyes of the business world. Snow fell gently outside, covering Charlotte in silent white. "I've made a decision," Callum began after their dishes were served. "A big one." Wren put down her fork, suddenly nervous. "What decision?" "I'm stepping down from the daily management of the company. Not immediately, but progressively over the next 6 months. I remain chairman of the board, but I'll appoint a new CEO. She stared at him, astonished. "Why?" "Because I've spent 20 years building an empire, and now I want to build a life." He took her hand across the table. "With you, if that's what you want too." "Callum, let me finish." He took a deep breath. "I know we've always been careful, slow, measuring every step, and that was necessary. But I'm 44 now, Wren. I have enough money to live 10 lives, and the only thing that truly makes me happy is you." Tears stung Wren's eyes. "And my work? My studies? You continue everything. I'm not asking you to choose between your career and me. I'm asking you to let me be part of your life while you build yours." He smiled, vulnerable and hopeful. "And maybe one day we could work together on something new. You've talked about sustainable architecture, projects that help communities. Imagine if we combined our resources, your vision, my experience." Wren realized she was crying now, tears silently flowing down her cheeks. "You would change your whole life for me?" "No, I would change my life for us. For the possibility of building something real and meaningful with someone who truly sees me." He gently wiped a tear from her face. "For years, I thought success was measured in dollars and properties. But you showed me that true success is measured in authentic moments, in real connections, in days when you wake up and you're excited to be alive. I don't know what to say. Say yes. His voice was soft but intense. Say you want to explore this with me. No rushing, no pressure. Just go slowly with me towards something new. The smile that lit up Ren's face was like sunrise. Go slowly, she repeated. Yes, let's go slowly, together. In that restaurant in Noda, as the snow continued to fall outside and Charlotte sparkled in the winter night, two people promised each other not perfection but authenticity, not ease but effort, not guarantees but faith. True love isn't about finding the perfect person, but about building something real with someone who sees you as you are and chooses you anyway, maybe even because of it all. 2 years later, on a summer afternoon in Charleston, Ren stood before a building she had helped design. It wasn't a luxury skyscraper or a clinical office complex. It was a community center in Charleston, her first completed architectural project, built in partnership with the Reed Foundation for Sustainable Housing. The building incorporated traditional low-country elements with modern, energy-efficient techniques. There were spaces for art classes, a library, community meeting rooms, and her favorite addition, a workshop where young people could learn trades. You did something extraordinary, Callum said, standing beside her in the southern summer heat. We did something extraordinary, she corrected. They weren't married. Ren had been clear that she wanted to establish her career independently before taking that step. But they lived together in an apartment in Charlotte that was a perfect blend of their two worlds, his taste for modern minimalism and her love for warm, personal touches. Callum had kept his promise. He'd stepped down from daily management of Reed Properties, retaining only a consulting role. Instead, he'd founded a non-profit organization focused on affordable housing and community development. Ren, who had finished her architecture degree with honors, now worked part-time for the company and part-time for the foundation. Do you remember that first day in the Blue Ridge? He asked, watching her admire her work. How could I forget? I was terrified. And you told me to go slowly. He smiled, the kind of authentic smile he'd learned to give freely now. It was the best advice I ever received. Ren's mother arrived for the inauguration, dressed in her best suit, tears flowing freely as she saw the name on the plaque. Marie Hartley Community Center, named in her honor for her years of service as a nurse in underserved neighborhoods. My daughter, she whispered, holding Ren tight, I'm so proud of you. Not because of what you built, but because of who you remained while building it. Even Mrs. Margot was present, her relationship with Ren having evolved into something surprising, mutual respect and even affection. The matriarch had admitted during a recent family dinner that Ren had brought her son back to life in a way she'd thought impossible. You're stubborn, too direct, and you refuse to play by the rules, Mrs. Margot had said. In other words, you're exactly what he needed. The inauguration drew over 200 people. Local residents, city officials, former colleagues from Reed Properties, university professors. When Ren stepped onto the improvised stage to speak, she felt no nervousness, only gratitude. This building, she began, her voice clear and confident, represents something more than architecture. It represents the belief that everyone deserves a space to grow, learn, and become who they're meant to be. She paused, her gaze finding Callum in the crowd. 3 years ago, I accepted a terrifying job in a new city. I didn't know if I'd belong in that world. I didn't know if I was good enough, but someone believed in me when no one else did. And more importantly, he taught me to believe in myself. The applause began, but she raised a hand to continue. This building is for every young person who feels like I felt. Not good enough, not rich enough, not sophisticated enough. For each of you, you are enough. You have always been enough. And with the right support, honest effort, and the courage to be authentic, there's no limit to what you can accomplish. As the sun declined over Charleston, painting the sky in pinks and oranges, Ren and Callum walked hand in hand through the streets of her childhood. Those streets that had once seemed narrow and limiting now appeared full of possibilities. Are you happy? He asked, the simple question loaded with everything they'd been through together. Ren stopped, turned to face him, framing his face with her hands. You know what I learned? What? That happiness isn't a destination. It's a decision we make every day. The decision to be authentic, to choose love despite fear, to build something meaningful rather than just something impressive. She kissed him softly. So yes, I'm happy. Not because everything is perfect, but because it's real. That night, sitting on the porch of her mother's house, watching the stars appear one by one, they talked about the future. More projects to build, communities to serve, maybe even a family to create one day. But only when the time was right, without rushing, always going slowly. You know what I realize, Wren said, her head resting on Callum's shoulder. What? That first day when I asked you to go slowly, I thought I was talking about the car. And you weren't talking about the car. No, she smiled in the darkness. I was talking about life, about slowing down enough to truly live every moment, to appreciate the journey rather than just rushing toward the destination. Callum kissed her forehead. You're the wisest teacher I've ever had. And you're the most stubborn student. They laughed, the sound mixing with the chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of the city settling for the night. A few months later, on a quiet afternoon in their Charlotte apartment, Callum presented Wren with a proposal. Not a marriage proposal, they'd agreed to wait a bit longer for that, but something different. I've been thinking about something, he said, unfolding plans on their dining table. What if we created a school of architecture and business? A place where young people from all backgrounds could learn not just technical skills, but also the philosophy of building with integrity, of succeeding with authenticity. Wren studied the plans, her mind already swirling with possibilities. A school based on the principles we learned together. Exactly. His eyes shone with excitement. You'd teach architecture with social consciousness. I'd teach business ethics. We'd have mentors who've overcome adversity, who understand real challenges. The Go Slowly School, Wren said suddenly. What? That's what we should call it, the Go Slowly School, because that's our philosophy. Going slowly but surely, with intention, with authenticity, building something lasting rather than just something fast. Callum looked at her with that gaze she'd come to recognize, a mixture of love, respect, and wonder. It's perfect. You're perfect. No, I'm not, she smiled, and that's what makes all of this real. The years that followed brought challenges. Of course they did. There were moments of doubt, disagreement, difficulty, but they navigated each obstacle with the same philosophy that had guided them from the beginning. Go slowly, communicate honestly, choose authenticity over appearances. The Go Slowly School opened its doors 3 years after that first conversation, housed in a renovated building in Southend. The first class included 40 students from diverse backgrounds, some from wealthy neighborhoods, others from modest families like Wren's. During the opening ceremony, Wren shared the story of those first terrifying days, of the request that changed everything, of the transformation that followed. Go slowly, she concluded, her voice carrying through the crowded auditorium, isn't a call to laziness or complacency. It's a call to intention, to awareness, to building lives and careers aligned with our values rather than just our ambitions. It's a reminder that speed isn't the same thing as progress, and that sometimes the longest road is the one that takes us where we truly need to be. 5 years after that first day in the Blue Ridge, Wren and Callum married in a simple ceremony at a vineyard near Charleston. It wasn't the grand event society expected. No hundreds of guests, no media coverage, no ostentation. Just 50 people they truly loved, in a place that held meaning, celebrating a love that had been tested and proven true. Mrs. Margot cried during the ceremony, not from sadness, but from joy. Wren's mother, too, holding Margot's hand in a gesture of solidarity that would have seemed impossible 5 years before. When the time came for vows, Wren and Callum had written their own. I promise you, Wren said, her hands trembling slightly as she held his, to continue reminding you to slow down when you're running too fast, to love you not despite your imperfections, but with them, to build a life together that's authentic rather than just impressive, and most of all to choose you every day, not because it's easy, but because it's true. Callum, tears flowing freely now, something he never would have allowed 5 years before, responded, I promise you to continue growing, learning, becoming a better version of myself through your example, to support your dreams with the same fierceness you've supported mine, to remind you, when you forget, how extraordinary you are, and to walk with you slowly but surely through all the seasons of this life we're building together. When they kissed, sealing their promises, the Charleston sun bathed them in golden light that seemed to bless the moment. The vineyard stretched around them, old and new at the same time, a perfect reminder that the best things take time to mature. At the reception, as the sun set and lantern lights came on, Sloane made a toast that summarized everything. To my brother, who learned that true courage isn't building walls, but tearing them down. And to Wren, who showed him how. You've taught us all that the best stories aren't those where everything is easy, but those where two people choose to face difficulties together, with honesty, with humor, and with love. Go slowly, all the guests shouted in chorus, raising their glasses, transforming those two words into a celebration of everything they represented. Not a limitation, but a liberation. Permission to live fully, authentically, without rushing toward a mythical future, but savoring every present moment. Years later, when Wren would be a recognized architect and Callum a respected philanthropist, when the Go Slowly School had produced hundreds of graduates who changed the world in their own ways, they would always return to that first day in the Blue Ridge. They would remember the fear, the vulnerability, the unexplainable connection that had sprung from two simple words, and they would teach their own children, eventually, that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest requests. Go slowly. Not because the road is too difficult, but because the destination isn't the point. The journey is the point. Every step, every breath, every moment of authentic connection, that's what constitutes a life well lived. And as Wren stood on the balcony of their Charlotte apartment that final night of their story, watching the city lights twinkle like stars fallen to earth, she understood with crystalline clarity that her life hadn't become what she'd imagined in her youth. It had become something better, something truer, something that was uniquely theirs. Callum joined her, wrapping her in his arms, and they stood together in silence, a comfortable, familiar silence, filled with everything they'd learned and built together. Happy? He whispered, the question having become a ritual between them. More than I thought possible, she answered truthfully, and it was true. Not because everything was perfect, life is never perfect, but because they had chosen authenticity over appearances, courage over complacency, love over fear. They had learned, these two people who met in a luxury car on a winding road, that the most beautiful destinations aren't found by going fast, but by going together. Slowly, always slowly, but surely. True love isn't a destination, but a continuous journey, and the greatest courage is committing to walk this path with authenticity, vulnerability, and the willingness to go slowly together through all the seasons of life.